Your story is really more incredible. I mean, not only just the 84 stuff and when White Lion probably should have launched, but also your whole Mabel thing where you're like a teen star.
Yeah. First of all, I'm like, I was never made for this business. I never really had any dreams. I grew up in a very hippie-oriented neighborhood in the 60s, you know, and I was very keen to the acoustic guitar and the Danish versions of Dylan and Neil Young, and of course also Dylan and Neil Young. So I'm raised on the folk guitar, campfire, sing along, and that is where my songwriting forte and many of the White Lion songs are brought to the table, and Vito would then take the melody from these songs and then, of course, add his virtuoso too, and then it became White Lion. So that has always been Mike Tramp's background. So even there, when you put me in a lineup next to Vince Neil and Bret Michaels and Sebastian and stuff like that, we are very much different. Once I decided that I wanted to, I mean, I was also raised on Freddie Mercury and David Bowie, so I always knew that the stage was a place you performed. But once David Roth came into my world and I saw that is the future of the look, that is, of course, what I sort of molded my way around when it came more as a stage persona. Of course, you can't compare our vocals, you can't compare our lyrics, you can't compare our stand in life or whatever, but it's just one of those things, you know. I got into this band when I was 15 and they were 10 years older than me. And before I knew it, I'd left school and I was jumping around stages for screaming girls. One turn went the other way, and bit by bit. And 4 years later, I had taken over the band. I said, there's not enough distortion on the guitars and we're going to America. And in 82, we came to America, and by the time we arrived in New York, we were called Lion. And it was just the beginning of the scene. And there were a lot of New York clubs and we got a lot of gigs, and it was like the first time we actually played the songs and people actually looked at us and says, this makes sense. And that's in November of 82 when I meet Vito in Lemoore in Brooklyn, and his band plays together with my band, and I look and I says, of course, this is the guy that I need to play with.
There was an incredible story, and I don't know if you even want to touch on it, but I just didn't think Steve Jones was giving that story the credit it deserved. But you were telling a story about, I guess, being in that, and I think you switched the name to Studs or whatever. It was right before you guys came over. But you were telling this amazing story that, yeah, you guys were in Spain and...
yeah, the Van Halen story.
Yeah, and Van Halen came over.
You know, the incredible thing about this story is Steve and I have been friends for many years because we used to play football, soccer with all the Europeans out there in Los Angeles. So yeah, I always respect that when the friendship remains, and he had space for me on his show, and it was a delight to be there. So of course that story fitted because it is the total opposite. And if you have space for your show on those, I'll give you two very incredible stories, which is so complete, different to the classic being on tour with someone. And the thing was, we were living in Spain. My band had moved down from Denmark and got a new career in Spain. Of course, also these four blonde guys from Denmark in the Latino country down there, you know, was very successful. And we were in the same record company that had the Warner catalog. And of course, I was a gigantic Van Halen fan. And when I saw that they were coming to Madrid for just promotion for the Fair Warning album, I called my guy at the record company and says, I got to meet the guys. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll do one better. You go to the airport with 4 limousines and pick up the band. And, you know, I spoke sort of like street Spanish from being there for years and stuff like that. So here I was. I mean, this is 1981. So I'm 20 years old. And my hair has just reached the shoulders, and it's blonde, and I got my leather jacket and so and so. And I go to the airport, and it's Madrid airport. And of course, I'm the only one in the airport looking like this. And the first one that comes out through, you know, security and stuff like that is Diamond Dave. And at that moment, he looked like 20 feet tall, dark wrapped around sunglasses that just made him look so evil and mean. And he looks around and doesn't wait for the other guys to come out. And then he sort of looks at me and he says, there's got to be something with this. And then he comes over, he says, man, who are you? He says, I says, you know, I'm Mike. I'm here from the record company to pick you guys up. He says, you got a joint. And I was like, I said, hamana. I can probably fix that. And then the other guys came out, and then Eddie and Michael and stuff like that, all smiles and stuff like that. And from the airport, I got into the limo with Eddie. And he had done a legendary interview in Guitar Player. The cover, he's there with the yellow and black strap, where he basically talks about how he dips his. This was prior to whatever anybody had done later, but how he fried his amps and stuff like that, and all this. And I ran through like a 100-question questionnaire, and Eddie sat there with a smile and answered everything. And so, the band is there for 3 days. And there are no fans at the hotel. Nobody knows they're there, and they're pretty casual. And I guess it's just one of those Warner Brothers tour around Europe. They really don't do a lot of press. So I'm with the band 3 days, constant, only me, the manager and the band. So all these different things. There's one time the record company is going to take the band out to paella, like a Spanish tradition dish, and Dave goes, "Hey, I want McDonald's." And I says, "I'll take you." So I jump in a cab, and I take Dave with me into a McDonald's, and he sits there and tells me all kinds of story in the taxi that I have no idea what's about. I get him a couple of cheeseburgers and stuff like that. I'm always kind of like, oh man, that's only cheeseburgers. And these two Spanish girls comes up and ask for my autograph when we sit at the table. What's going on here? And at that time, we had just done. I had changed the name from my Danish band, which we were called Mabel. It was out of Shakespeare. That's what they told me. I didn't know later on when I came to America that it was something completely different. That's a different story. But now I had decided that this band was heading in the direction of American hard rock. And one night I had sat up and I looked at reading English New Musical Express Melody Maker, and it was just the beginning of what they call the new wave of British heavy metal. So this journalist were talking about the kids in the studded leather jackets, and I went, studs? And I sat I sat with a napkin or a piece of paper, and I drew these two studs, sort of like the emblem of like two German hand grenades from the uniform from Second World War. And I said to myself, this is probably the most badass logo I've ever seen. The record company finalized it, and we did the album and stuff like that. So one day I go to the hotel and I have like 4 or 5 albums with me, because I think that all I'm going to do is I'm going to give this to the band, and they say, of course, you're the support band of our next tour in America.
Right.
And I'm up at Dave's room, and I pull this album out and I give it to Dave and says, Dave, this is my album. This is my band. And he looks at it and he goes, studs. That ain't gonna work in America. They'll think you're the New Village People. And it took me a long-ass time to figure out what that meant. And then one day, my bass player from band says, you know what? I think he's referring to what's going on down in New York in some of those dark clubs and stuff like that. I says, well, that ain't gonna work. So that's when I told you earlier, on the flight over to America, when we went there in the summer of '82, we arrived as Lion. But there's one final end to the story. In '88, we have a party in L.A., and Eddie and Valerie Bertinelli shows up. I have the photo right here. Vito and I get a nice picture with Eddie, and I look at Eddie and says, I got to tell you a story. I says, do you remember like 7 years ago when you came to Madrid, there was a young guy, following you around, and he goes, shit. And he looked at Valerie and he says, I remember that. And for a long time after, I became good friends with Eddie a lot of places and shared a lot of times. But it was great to both be acknowledged as a band, but also he had remembered that story and thought it was very funny. And 2 years ago, when Wolfgang Van Halen came here to promote his project, I told him the story, and he had almost had tears in his eyes. Those are the great stories from the past.
Yeah, there's several photos of, or I saw some online with Dave in his shades that you're talking about, looking evil,
exactly.
and you with shorter hair. That's incredible.
Yeah.
There was also a part to the story where you see David Lee Roth like years later, and he's like kind of.
I mean, well, the story goes like that. Is I've always paid attention, and I'm a big reader, and so obviously my fascination for American rock and stuff like that. I'd also met some American kids from the Air Force Base El Torrejon in Madrid, and they really started introducing me. This was way before Van Halen meeting, but they started introducing to American rock and roll and how the kids were changing it. And they introduced me to Cream magazine. To me, it was like going to school. I soaked everything up. I always said to myself, when I arrive in America, I'm not a tourist. I'm part of rock and roll. And I had remembered reading an article of Van Halen. This was even prior. That probably goes back to 1978 or 79, where there's this photo montage from Van Halen and stuff like that, and there's this woman fitting the pants on Dave and stuff like that, and it said her name, and that was the woman to be my wife later on.
Right, you married her.
Fleur Thiemeyer, the one who basically designed the look of the 80s. You know, the famous red and white pants on the second Van Halen album when Roth does a split in there. At the same time, also one of my absolutely best friend through many years is still Neil Zlozower, classic rock photographer, probably taking more pictures of Van Halen and Dave than anybody else. I'm living up at Lake Tahoe, and this is sort of around maybe 96, 97, and Roth comes up there and plays a casino, and I go there together with my wife Fleur and Neil Zlozower. So I'm actually together with two of the people who has been closest to David Lee Roth than almost no people. They've both seen him naked, etc., and stuff like that. Even my ex-wife had gone out and sort of dated with David Lee Roth, even just as a visual date, whatever you might make out of that. Now, this is just 500 people in casino, and then after the show, we go backstage, and there's only the three of us. And then David Lee Roth and his security guard, Eddie, who had been with him all through the Van Halen years. Dave is running the show backstage like this is fucking Madison Square Garden, and he doesn't know us. And I'm thinking, I understand if he doesn't acknowledge me. That's fine. But here's the woman who's measured his pants while he was standing there naked and designing the early look of Van Halen. And here's the photographer who has done the most legendary photos of David Lee Roth ever. And he's basically treating them like they've just flown in from Oklahoma. I couldn't believe it. When we were driving home after, I was just going, what the hell? It was just the character he was playing. David Lee Roth, in one way, is a very, very intelligent person. The show must go on.